Okay, we are officially starting. All right, welcome everyone to Art, Social Studies, and Literacy in the School Garden. My name is Dinah Mack. I'm the Education Program Manager with Massachusetts Farm to School. I am so excited to be here with Fatima Sek, who is the School Garden Coordinator at the Mel King School. And Fatima will introduce herself as well. And I'm very excited for this workshop. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A. And I'm here, Fatima, I'm going to turn my camera off so all eyes will be on you. And just let me know when you want to advance the slide.
Perfect, will do. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Fatima. I work for Haley House, which is a nonprofit organization based all around Boston, doing urban agriculture, reentry, cooking programs. We've got a lot going on. But one thing we do is provide school garden services to the Mel King South End Academy, which is right next door to our soup kitchen. I'm going to talk today a little bit about how we can pull in arts education, humanities education, literacy skills and education directly into school garden work. So I used to work in art museums and culture. I still do to some extent. I work around visual culture, arts-based learning, museum pedagogy, public art. And so for me, I'm really grounded in learning about history and culture. And so I brought a lot of that into my work into school gardens. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can just like really allow that that intersection to just like proliferate in our education and our teaching and our learning in school gardens. So that we can kind of move past, I think sometimes we can talk a lot about advocating for more school gardens and having more of the physical space, which is really important. But I think when we over tie school gardens to science learning specifically, we just really limit the ability for school gardens to do the really beautiful work within school. So for me, I'm all about moving past the school garden towards school garden cultures, right? Where school gardens are providing a source of really comprehensive, tactile learning experiences that can feed into all elements of education and learning at one school, and also other forms of health and well-being. So really leaning into how we can use arts, social studies, and literacy in the garden to foster school garden cultures and how we can do that in our work. So next slide. So I'm going to talk first. Oh, last thing I'm going to say also is please ask questions. I enjoy questions. It's a little bit hard in this webinar forum to go, straight into the conversation space. But the way I'll set this up today is that I'll do a little bit of a spiel. I'll talk big picture about kind of specific activities, but also ways of thinking that we can adopt in our school garden work that can really empower engagement with kind of the non-science or humanities or arts and culture based side of learning, but also kind of go through concrete examples and lesson plans that you can use. And then also I'll leave a little bit of time at the end for us to do questions. So that's the overview for today. So first thinking about geography and how there are these like big, huge global foodways and global pathways and ways that food travels through trade and through colonialism, through migration, and finds its way onto our plates and onto our big busy streets where there's restaurants that have and reflect cuisines from different parts of the world. So how can we bring that kind of global ethic and global view of food into our gardens? The example that I'm showing in this image right here is something that I like to do in the spring. This is a great spring activity. I get legumes. I just go to the grocery store and get, beans, lentils, rice, and have the young people create recipes. So they have to kind of channel, think about what is something that you eat at home? What is something that you remember someone who cooks for you making? What is a food you like to eat when you leave the house? And it kind of challenges them to think a little bit about creating connections between crops and ingredients. Sometimes there can be a disconnect. We talk a lot about how, over time we become disconnected from the knowledge of where our food comes from. So by creating a little seed jar or a recipe jar, we've called them both, it encourages young people to really think about how everything they're experiencing on their plate originated as a crop or originated as some other life form. And also we're really getting to experience the diversity of the young people in the space, right? So some of them will be really, really drawn to the sesame seeds. Some of them will be really, really drawn to things like black beans and rice, or others to lentils. And through that, we start to get exposed at a really early time in the season. In the springtime, this is great for when there's nothing to do outside, or it's just a little bit too chilly to be out there. We start to get a little bit exposed to what kind of diversity are we experiencing on our plates, and also what type of diversity exists just in the classroom and with that group unit of young people. So why don't we go to the next slide? So tying into that, I think that, that activity, that CJA activity is a great way to get a little bit of a gauge on who the student demographic is, if that's not information you have available to you. But I'll say that all of this education, every way that we can imagine integrating arts and cultural and historical education and literary education into our gardens really does begin in the spring through our crop planning. So how can we think about, really adopting a culturally responsive ethic in our crop planning and in our garden design? I think there's been such a movement over the last few, I mean, maybe decades, but especially in the last few years around really growing a diverse array of crops. It's just amazing what you can find. I think some of you, I don't know if there's the raised hand option or but I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Underground Railroad tomatoes, right? That you can find at True Love Seeds, Plat de Haiti tomatoes, which are, I think were brought from, I don't know if it was actually formerly enslaved people from Haiti, but it was people who left Haiti around the time of the enslaved the revolution that freed the country, and brought it to the Americas. And there's this way that you can plant a garden that really reflects, a really global scene of what the world is. And when we're thinking about the lessons that we want to teach in August, in September, how can we start in spring and in March and in February with creating a set of seed-based experiences that are really exposing young people to just how historical of an event one little seed is. I always, whenever we plant, the image to the far left, is two young people planting the Underground Railroad tomatoes. They're just little seeds from them, or maybe they're actually at that point, they're holding the seedlings. How can we really communicate to young people that inside of this one little seed is generations of history, generations of people choosing to keep a seed alive? And why would someone do that? What type of memory and, cultural responsibility is inside of a seed? And how can we communicate that to young people? And for me, I think a big part of that is storytelling and creating the opportunity for them to really, create connections between the crop and the story, and the crop and narrative. So later I'll talk a little bit more about history and narrative. But the more storytelling we can bring into the garden, I think sometimes, of course, the point of bringing kids outside is, let's use our senses, let's touch, let's eat, let's smell things. That's really, really important. But there's a way that bringing storytelling into the picture can really create a sense of affect and create a sense of love and a sense of deeper curiosity, and also a sense of responsibility of like, no, we're not just planting these because these tomatoes are going to taste good, although they're going to taste really, really good. We're also planting these in the name of the enslaved person who would have kept these in their pockets while they ran, on the Underground Railroad to freedom. And in our case specifically, we're very lucky. Our garden's in the South End, which is a neighborhood that is full of history. I'm going to talk later about the connection we made directly, to these, Underground Railroad tomatoes, and a Black History project that we did a little bit later in the summer. But just to illustrate a couple more of these photos and a couple more of what we're thinking when I talk crop planning for cultural education. So to the top right, those are black-eyed peas from Senegal. So we talked a little bit about, if you see the image right below that, we do a lot of activities that involve using things like atlases, using things like images of maps, like there below, using globes, so we can start to locate so where are we physically, where is the United States of America? Where is Boston on a map? And then we go further and we can use our seeds and use our crops to really illustrate where are we, where are we? Where does our food come from? Where does this experience of eating this little black-eyed pea, where did that originate? If it originated in Senegal. And so we can start to create these connections between these abstract countries, and these kind of really and also abstract countries, but also this big global scale, and make it really small for a group of small children, bring the global into this little garden. And the image to the left, at the bottom left, is us, creating, just little flags. So we illustrate, where crops come from with images of flags, and that's also a way to incorporate some art into the garden. So we have, the opportunity to talk a little bit about nationality and flags, what's represented in flags, but also really, reveals to us, how diverse our garden is. Oh, and last thing I'll say, is that part of what we can do in this process is to encourage independent seed saving. So you'd be surprised by how many young, well, I mean, I'm sure we're also gardeners in this space, but I'm sure so many of us have stories of young people mentioning a grandmother who has a garden, or an auntie, in Atlanta who loves to grow things. And so, when we talk about this seed and we talk about this one seed that ended up being kept for generations and being kept in stories with it being kept, we can empower young people to keep seeds they might encounter in their lives, right? So whether it's legumes from the kitchen table or from their food pantry, whatever it may be, or whether it's from a person in their life who actually grows things, we can start to get them familiar with the concept of seed saving and encourage independent seed saving, that they can use for themselves, but also we can empower young people to hold on to those seeds or gift them to us, and then we can grow the seeds of young people in the garden. Next slide, please. Thank you. So tied to this thinking about like global foodways, and we talked about the images of flags and how we can use maps and geography tools to empower young people to really think about um, how this global world moves through food and is made visible through food, and also how we can make that land in our garden. The world is also languages. And many of us might be teaching at schools where for the majority of children, I know this is true for where I work, are going home to environments where English is not the primary language. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can adopt an ethic that acknowledges multilingual students, that acknowledges students who are not speaking. Welcome everyone. Adopt an ethic that really is mindful of just the kind of multilingual environments that young people are growing up in. So we can explore language in the garden by directly making an effort to label things in multiple languages. So if you have signs, little signs of what crops, are growing, these are tomatoes, let's make sure that, if the students are also from Vietnam and from Haiti, that we are also describing what those words are in different languages. And what that also facilitates is that young people can then bring that knowledge back home. It can be a little bit difficult to translate some of the experiences we're having, from English into whatever language is being spoken at home. So if we adopt a multilingual ethic in our gardens, we can just make it easier for a young person to have conversations and to create a flow between the kind of domestic space that they experience at home and then this public space that they experience at school and the garden in it. So here's an example. Maybe I'll start with the bottom right of us going to we went to a local grocery store in the Puerto Rican neighborhood nearby. I've mentioned that we're really lucky to be in the South End, which is just full of diversity. I mean, South End is full of a lot of things, but there are pockets of South End that are full of diversity, full of people from just all kinds of different cultures. And we went to a Puerto Rican grocery store and we just looked at different labels and we compared them. We talked about seeing different languages on labels. We talked about seeing, right now, this young person is looking at Goya spices, I think, but we also looked at some of the legumes that we made our seed jars out of, right? So how do we say black bean in Spanish, things like that. And like, what groceries are we seeing? When we went to Stop and Shop once a while ago when we were at our farm, what groceries do we see there versus which ones are we seeing at this Puerto Rican supermarket, right? So trying to create a little bit of comparison there and just a sense of perspective, but also embracing how there are just so many languages that we can use to describe food. And then I also have an example here of we made a little herb spice. That's a really fun activity with kids, which is just sea salt and then any herbs you've got, and you can just dry them really slowly in the oven over time. These are a great thing to give home, young people, wherever they go after school. The good thing about it is non-perishable. It can just last a very, very long time. So young people love to bring it with them. It also comes, we take cute little packets, but having those be multilingual and describing what they are, again, really empowers young people to be able to describe, what they're doing at school more easily at home, but it also empowers parents to feel a little bit more involved linguistically with what their children are doing at school. So if we're teaching in multilingual environments, we can really do our best to adopt a multilingual pedagogy. And of course, it doesn't mean learning 17 languages or however many languages are represented at your school. But, there are little ways that we can just create a sense of inclusion, a sense of inclusion for a parent who just feels more comfortable in Vietnamese. Like you might speak English, but, maybe you just want to read what your son was doing in school today in Vietnamese, and that could just make you feel good. And it also can make a young person feel a sense of pride. Oh, I see a comment and I want to read it. Um, uh, yeah, absolutely. I think I'll give that a closer look in a moment. But yeah, I think there are so many ways where, when you think about a school garden, I think one of the beautiful things about it is that it creates like an experience not only for the young person, but for an entire family, because we're talking about food and we're talking about something that is at the center, at the heart of family life, right? So I think if we really start to think about like, how can we be thinking about this young person, not as an isolated individual, but someone who is tied to some sort of family, some sort of connection of people, even if it may not be a nuclear family or may not be a, it could be a foster home, but the young person is connected to a group of people. And how can we be thinking about that group of people that they're connected to through our school garden work? So embracing a multilingual ethic is another way to think about integrating a kind of humanities approach into school gardens. And next slide. So I want to also now talk a little bit about literacy, which really ties directly into language. Um, you know, when we talk about labeling things, labeling crops in more than one languages, what we're talking about is expanding vocabulary. And I think sometimes we can limit, when we think about literacy, we think about like the early learning blocks of literacy for young people, which is like really learning how to sound things out, which, is not always the best fit for the school garden environment, but literacy is actually a whole wealth of experiences that empower young people to be able to communicate better and be able to express their own ideas and also engage well with the expressed ideas of others, right? So, expanding vocabulary, opportunities for storytelling. Right here, this young person is reading a book of stories, a little zine of stories about a garden, about this garden that was written by the middle schoolers. So here's an elementary schooler reading something that was written by the middle schoolers about the garden. So we're creating these also like multi-layered experiences, which is tied, I think, to how we can think about a school garden as something, going past school gardens to having school garden cultures. Well, how can we make sure there's communication happening between the different ages, right? How can we have the older students, facilitate experiences for younger people, even if it's not directly, but through kind of indirect experiences like these. So if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about that process. So one thing that we did this spring, spring, maybe more like kind of early or like sometime in the summer, we had all the young people, all the middle schoolers, write stories about the garden and write different reflections. And so, we brought the Chromebooks outside, which I know some people it might be, that might be the boundary, that might be the line. Like, I get it. We're there to bring the kids out, away from the computers. But I think sometimes there can be an opportunity to, similar to what I'll talk about later, of how part of the purpose of bringing in arts and literature into the garden is to engage the students who just might not like dirt, who are so valid. As a young person who was the artsy kid who did not want to play outside, I respect those kids are so very valid. So the Chromebooks, it created an opportunity for a young person who doesn't always like gardening, to get to engage in a different way. They wrote stories, they read them out loud. You went to Thornton Street Farm, which is also a Haley House managed farm out in Roxbury. And they got to read their story and share it with the rest of their crew, which also was a, kind of a team bonding experience, a public speaking opportunity, and really think about like, what is the story you want to tell? And this is not, how can you explain this to me so I understand it better? Writing for clarity. These are experiences of making meaning out of their own lives and having the opportunity to kind of reflect on an experience they're having. Because for many of these young people, working in the garden is a very unique experience that's worth, engaging with in a different way, in a way that really has a lot of intention around it. So we're practicing description or practicing how to articulate our experiences, just describe what we're feeling with Mass Farm to School. So maybe somewhere on the archive website, I did a workshop on social emotional learning in gardens and how a major tenet of social emotional development really is just knowing how to communicate. I think a young person can really become dysregulated when they're feeling something but can't describe what. So when they're learning literacy skills, it's not just about being able to write the most beautiful poem or short story ever, which they do and have, and I will talk about. It's also about the sense of empowerment in your own life to say, I'm feeling something or I'm thinking something. How do I express it to someone else so that they understand me? So it's a really important side of literacy. And then also, turning their stories into a little zine. They just felt so proud, of having created something that they're all a part of and all their names were on it. they had there's a little cover illustration as well. And these were just scenes that we did later print out hardcovers, but we just, this was just printed on a printer and bound with staples. So, that creates a sense of like, oh, this is what a book is. A book is just somebody's story. It's just somebody's perspective. And I think, we have to do a little bit of, PR development, or is that the word I'm looking for? We just have to like kind of rebrand books a little bit. We gotta bring them in. Not to say that there isn't a lot of popularity around books with young people, but I think there are some ways that, there are the pandemic created a certain attachment for young people, to kind of phones and digital forms of media. But the fact of creating your own forms of print media can really liberate and empower a sense of connection to books, that can really foster a sense of literacy over time. So yeah, it was a beautiful collection of books, collection of stories about the garden. In fact, if anybody would like a copy, maybe I can share some because we do have a couple extra, but it was phenomenal. I mean, this example in the top right corner was somebody reflecting on giving bok choy to someone who comes to our food pantry, and a kind of uncomfortable experience of somebody having snatched it out of their hands and how it made him feel, but how he understood why someone might have been very desperate, or, kind of a little aggressive, wanting food, just a really beautifully compassionate reflection. Someone else wrote, a very imaginative story about what would go down if an apocalypse, hit the garden right now. So now I know exactly what to do in the event of a UFO apocalypse in the garden because a young person wrote about it. So now I feel empowered and liberated in my sense of communication. So everybody's winning here. You can do next slide. Um, Expanding vocabulary is also, this is tied to that thing of like, how important it is, just the sense of like knowing how to communicate your feelings, and not for the sake of for not for the sake of anything, but just for how it creates connection with others, for how it creates connections with others, how important it is as a young person to feel understood. That's such a that's a big part of the wounds of being young, of just constantly feeling misunderstood. And I think one place when you talk about literacy, it's not just about reading dense books, it's about this sense of like, I can communicate what I'm feeling and thinking, and that is empowering. And I can feel understood. I can find that. So, expanding vocabulary is tied to that. It's also, we can make it fun. So labels for everything are friends and everything. Cause I think we'll sometimes label things like, we'll label the tomato bed, right? But do we label our trowels? Do we put a little label on, if you have a shed, the shed, a little label on garden bed? We can really, and some young people really relish in something, in any kind of little, like some people just love those little cards, and some people read them over and over again. But I think not, it's a couple things, not making any presumptions about words that children would know versus what they wouldn't. Like trowel is one that we has to come up a lot. Garden bed, sometimes, we can say something like, okay, let's go to garden bed number 4. And like, what do you mean garden bed? What is that? And that's a fair question, so labeling things as much as possible, as much as we can, creating opportunities to, get specific with language. Oh, what is this? Like, I'm going to tell you exactly, or what type of bird is this? Like really kind of finding opportunities to expand vocabulary whenever we can. So, and we can also do that through word games and group storytelling. So we did this really fun game, thinking about how to use, what makes up a sentence, what are the different building blocks of a sentence? And then we created sentences together. We need a subject, we need a verb, we need a noun, we need an object of comparison. And we created this whole kind of line of poems that the young people at the bottom are reading together. I can actually read a couple of the building blocks of so I don't know if you can tell, but it's like each card, a young person pulls one. There's a subject, right? There's a verb, and then there's, kind of other connectors. And they ended up writing lines like, Miguel is a grower as revolutionary as those spicy peppers, or summertime has vitality exceeding a whole neighborhood. Katea is a fighter as awesome as a blue jay, right? So there's all these my science teacher is a creative force as cool as a black squirrel. They just wrote these like really fun, amazing sentences that come together as a poem, and they had a lot of fun rearranging things and seeing, what was possible with language. So these are, and significant is that all of the objects of comparison and all the subjects were all tied to the garden. So we can really, really use languages, the language of the garden, to both expand vocabulary, to see what we can create, what kind of beauty we can create with just the language that's available to us from just looking around a garden. Next slide, please. Cool, the arts. I think I think we use a lot of arts in school garden education, I would say. I mean, I feel like there's just always something to paint. um, although I don't know, Guy, I don't know everyone. I feel like I have such a hard time with painting with young people because it's like it's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of cleanup, and then I'm just constantly in this like, is it worth it? And it usually is because they make wonderful art. But I will say that these acrylic markers made a big difference for me. So this little chapter we're going to be talking about garden engagement beyond the plants themselves, because like I said, some of us are the artsy fartsy kids over here. We just wanted to paint all day and play the flute or whatever we did. So, we can create space for them in the garden. Absolutely. Everybody's welcome here. So, a lot of that just looks like activities like some of the ones that I've illustrated here. So, we make little garden gnomes out of, what's it called? Air dry clay. We've also used wooden peg dolls to make garden gnomes, and we just have them hang out all over the garden. Other little kinds of decorative works of art to just put onto garden beds, sometimes painting directly on garden beds. This ties directly back into some of our literacy efforts, which will also include, reading books, and engaging with books. So we made bookmarks out of some of our flowers from the summer. We just used resin. So there's some really cute, handy dandy little bookmarks that like you want to read when you have a bookmark like that. You absolutely do. And it's also a great way to kind of use up some of because we're a school garden, we kind of operate on a specific timeline. And it's like these marigolds are still going because it's beautiful out, but it's time to, it's a wrap. It's time the hay bales are going on these beds. So we got to use up these flowers. So, there's just a couple examples of arts activities. But if we go to the next slide, just because I know that, just because I know that we have I feel like, we do a lot of painting and activities and stuff in the garden. What I just did want to propose and just put out there, and this is something that I think a lot of school gardeners and urban growers do, is just engaging students in repairs. That also feels very creative, and because it is, right? It's very they're life skills, really. So, in the top right, we had Youth Build Boston, amazing organization. They built us these really beautiful new garden beds early last spring, as in spring of 2023. And so the young people, in this case, this young person is painting it with acrylic, but they also helped paint it, cover it with linseed oil, right? To just like, to seal it. So that's the kind of way they can be involved in using some of the kind of tactile sensory experience of making art, but they're actually helping us with like repairs and maintenance. Or just below that image is a young person repainting, where we're repainting the fence, is it wrought iron fence that surrounds the garden, right? So it's a repair. It's not necessarily art in the set. Sometimes I think young people can get a little bit stuck with the task of being creative, make a work of art. Like, what does that mean? Or it doesn't turn out how they want. But this is very, it's kind of using you're painting something, right? But you're also without the responsibility maybe of having to also imagine an idea and see it through and execute it. So it can be kind of an interesting point of access for people. And then with that, we have all these bricks because we're in South End, so there's bricks coming up all the time. So before mortaring the bricks back into the ground, I had the young people decorate them first, and then they could also learn with me how to mortar things back into the ground. So we all learned that day you can definitely very visibly see what was us versus what was like the skilled professionals who did that in South End back in whatever, maybe in the 60s or whenever those bricks are first laid. But there's a creative engagement for the young people that's, I guess it's not art necessarily, but it's certainly a creative life skill that they can utilize. So I think when I'm just thinking, what I just want to offer to engaging young people in arts in the garden is that we can really engage them in some of the actual repairs that need to be done all the time, because there's constant maintenance of some kind or another, and they can be a part of it, and they very often enjoy it. We can go next slide. Um, last, I just wanted to talk a little bit about history. The kind of last chapter, just thinking a little bit about how we can use history and think about history and reflect on history and make meaning of it through the garden. It's any garden is a historical garden, right? Like even if a garden, emerged, you make your first bed tomorrow, Boston was the first place in the world, well, in the United States, to have a school garden. All right. So, we have and it was in Roxbury too, which was a very different neighborhood in was it 18 it was sometime in the early 1800s that the first school garden in America was born, right? And Roxbury wasn't what it was now at the time, of course, but I think it's really interesting to think about how whenever we have a school garden, it's part of this long, long, long lineage that originated here in Boston and then proliferated out, to the rest of the United States. Um, and we're a part of that. We're a part of that legacy. So it's always historical, right, to be a part of a school garden. And how can we teach young people that history? How can we talk about, what role does a garden play in our communities? What do gardens do? Why are gardens important? Who can come together because a garden exists? And that's when I want to think a lot about Mel King, who, I don't know if I said this, but in the beginning slide, the very first one, there were the flowers, and there was that image of a guy running for mayor. That was Mel King. Melvin H. King was a community organizer, a politician, a civil rights leader, born in South End, just like spent really his entire life basically just trying to make Boston a better place to live. And he did that in many, many different ways, including passing the 1974 Farm and Garden Act, which is an act that I'm not totally sure if it lives on now as the right to farm law. I might be completely wrong about that, but at the time, excuse me, it was a form of legislation, or was a piece of legislation that allowed for any vacant lot to be legally turned into a farm or a garden. And it's really beautiful when you think about that history in the context of, at the same time, there was the East Berkeley Gardens, where at the time, Chinese farmers, Chinese growers were guerrilla gardening in the space, and people were calling the cops on them. People were, trying to get them arrested, lighting their gardens on fire, tearing stuff up, right? Just because people were using a vacant lot in South End to try to garden, and they didn't look like some of the people who lived in South End. And so I think Mel King passed this piece of legislation kind of in an effort to protect them, but also make a lot of beauty possible. I think a lot of school gardens, of course, are on school property, so it's a little different. But if you walk around your neighborhood, you walk around your city, I always try to remind students, every time you walk by a garden, you have to thank Mel King, especially because we are the Mel King Academy. Every time you walk by a garden in Boston, you thank Mel. Thank Mel for making it possible for us to have so many every little corner, every little pocket, especially in South End, there's just a beautiful little garden there. So we can really tie the bigger picture history of Boston and urban agriculture into our individual garden work. And through that, talk a little bit about like, what do gardens make possible? What makes them valuable parts of our communities, of our schools? Here's some workshops we did. We've done scavenger hunts in the garden of like trying to find, that's a great way to kind of engage young people, put photos all around and have them read, we read prompts or have them read prompts and have them search for the image that corresponds. And it's just a great way to like be moving through space while learning about history. We did that to learn a little bit more about Mel. There's someone holding up a photo of Tent City, which Mel King is the reason that Tent City, well, him and also many other activists who fought to ensure that the plot of land at Tent City, which is an apartment affordable housing building of apartments, and now sits on, did not become a parking lot and did become affordable housing instead. Mel King was just a really prolific activist and prolific advocate for just the well-being of people in Boston. So we've been making these, postcards and collages, which are another great way to talk about history, using imagery, really leaning into tactile experiences, right? And so we have this like wonderful postcard that somebody made, which has an image of Mel and a cardinal, which is totally coincidental because, cardinals are all up in the South End. And then there's also the mural of Mel King that's on O'Brien, I think, where there's a cardinal on his shoulder, but I don't think that young person knew that. And also, I'm pretty sure that's a cardinal, and it's not a red, well, maybe the same. It's not important. I'm getting lost in the weeds. The other images in that collage is a person holding some, is it scallions, I think, and those were given to her by a student, right? This is someone who comes to our food pantry, and then a couple words, victory, change, which I think Mel really stood for. So there's just a little bit about how we can integrate kind of historical education into our gardens. And then the last slide. And this is again when I come back to like how lucky we are to be in the South End, which is just full of history. But also let me say, we all live in Massachusetts. Well, that might not be true, but enough of us, I'm sure, in this room live in Massachusetts and or Boston, which is everywhere is full of history. You turn a corner in Massachusetts and there's a plaque that's like, hey, this is the first time this ever happened in the history of everything. You know what I mean? So I'm sure there are ways in different ways in all of our neighborhoods and all of our communities where we can tap draw connections between our little space and the global world around us and the global histories or just larger histories around us. And of course, for all of us in a garden, it's really important that we talk about the history, the global history of agriculture and specifically slavery. It's really it's an important thing to acknowledge because it was such a transformative event in what it means to have food and what it means to consume food, what how certain seeds arrived in our hands, right? So to come back to how lucky we are to be in the South End, we spent last summer doing a whole entire project about Frederick Douglass, who wrote a speech called "What is a Slave to the Fourth of July?" So during the summer, we just talked a lot about like, well, what was slavery? Why would the Fourth of July not mean the same thing to an enslaved person as to somebody else, right? Or someone who's a descendant of slaves than to somebody else, and how does that show up in our garden? So to go back to those Haitian tomatoes we were growing, to go back to the Underground Railroad tomatoes we were growing, the young person at the bottom right is standing in front of the Haitian and Underground Railroad tomatoes as they read that speech out loud. So we made a video of all of them together reading the speech. It was all of the middle schoolers, we all cut, spliced the speech into different bits and bobs, and everybody read their paragraph. And so it was really an opportunity to kind of talk a lot about Black history and move through South End as we did it. So there's an image of some of the elementary schoolers hanging out with Miss Harriet Tubman at the statue in South End. We also, is a stop of the Underground Railroad in South End, which is insane and extremely cool. And we went there. So you can see at the bottom left corner, two young people holding an image of Harriet Tubman in front of the League of what I believe is called the League of Women for Community Service, which also Coretta Scott King lived there when she was a young person, when she was in her 20s and a student in Boston. And before that, oral history suggests, and oral history is really all we've got when it comes to the Underground Railroad, that it was a stop there. So we really walked that ground thinking about what would it feel like to have been running to that door, where we're all sitting, and maybe running with those seeds that we just planted in the spring and with seeds of those tomatoes we just ate in your pockets, you know what I mean? And to sit on those stairs and be free, So, through talking about slavery, we can talk about, the big picture of trade in the world. We can talk a lot about mass production. We can talk about like, whenever they, yeah, well, we can talk all day about children making slavery jokes in the in the garden, but there's always an opportunity in there to create empathy actually with an enslaved person because it's like, okay, you're making this joke about how we feel like slaves right now, but it's like, imagine how hard it actually would have been to do this. Imagine how hard it really would have been to do this all day on very little food, on no nourishment of any kind, physical, emotional, and while enduring all kinds of suffering, right? So there's so many opportunities in a garden to create really deep empathy with enslaved people, really deep gratitude for enslaved people who fed the world, who fed the world and made so much possible, so much creativity possible for a lot, creativity and life possible for a lot of us, who for many of us, most of us, in fact, at the Mel King Academy are descended from, right? So, we can really tie in discussions about slavery through arts-based activities, through oral history storytelling, like we did with this speech, through engaging with other forms of media. We can do that as a way to really create empathy and gratitude, to people who really suffered in the name of, well, of course, in the name of greed, but they suffered and endured, and we can just kind of pay our respects by moving their stories forward with as much dignity as possible. So, how can we imagine dignified storytelling around enslaved people in the farm and garden? And how can we do that through, movement, engaged activities, through story opportunities for young people to tell their own stories, to reflect? How can we draw on all these things I just talked about, right? The arts, literacy, storytelling of all kinds, geography, tactile experiences. How can we pull all of that together with the ultimate goal of really just making it possible for young people to tell dignified stories about themselves, and also the world? So I would love to open it up to questions, but also comments and like and discussion and just discussion of all kinds. We have a little bit of time with us. I guess I will say, yeah, please stay in touch. The Substack lobby, they got me. They got me a couple days ago. So if anybody would like to just follow my work, I do similar workshops. I have a workshop coming up called Paint Your Pantry, which is about the tie between the history of food and the history of art. I just did one this weekend, but there's going to be a second one at Harvard Art Museums at December 14th. So you're all more than welcome. And if you'd like to stay updated with any kind of similar workshops, you can subscribe on Substack. But thank you all so much for coming. And I just want to open up maybe we can go back to the first slide because I feel embarrassed. And then we can, yeah, have a discussion from there. But thank you all so much for coming.
Fatima, I think I'm gonna stop recording
Awesome.
and then I'm gonna open it up so people can come in and talk. Let me figure out how to do that. Okay.